and he found it a hard task at first, as he could not speak our tongue. At last a man was found who spoke French, and him Steuben made his aide-de-camp and kept him close at hand. The men were slow to learn, for the drills were new to them, and Steuben would get wroth with them and call them blockheads and all sorts of hard names. But though he had a sharp tongue and was quick to get in a rage, he had a kind, true heart, and soon won the love of the men. For 8 months the Redcoats had held Philadelphia. In the spring, General Howe went home and left his troops in charge of Sir Henry Clinton, who made up his mind to lead the troops back to New York. But he did not wish his plans to be known. In the meantime, Washington knew that a scheme of some sort was on foot, so he sent troops out to check the king's troops should they move by land. The Redcoats left Philadelphia on June 18th, and as there was but one road for them to take, their train stretched out for 12 miles. They made a halt at Allentown, and Clinton had not quite made up his mind which way to go from that place. He at first thought he would go as far as the Raritan River, and then ship his troops to New York. But when he found that our troops were not far off, he turned to the right and took the road to Monmouth. His march was a slow one. The heat was great. The rains made the roads bad, and they had to stop to bridge the streams and to build causeways so that they could cross the swamps. Washington, in the meantime, had gone on to Kingston, but as soon as he learned Clinton's course, he moved his troops so as to get in the rear of the Redcoats. On the night of June 27th, the foe went in camp on the high ground near Monmouth Courthouse. The vanguard of our troops was 5 miles off and in charge of General Lee. At daybreak, the vanguard of the Redcoats set forth down the hill, while Clinton, with his choice troops, stayed in camp on the heights of Freehold to give the long train of carts and pack mules a chance to get well on the way. At 8 o'clock, all were in line of march to Middletown. As soon as Lee heard that the foe were on the move, he set out to meet them and was joined by the troops in charge of Lafayette. As Lee stood on one of the hills, he caught sight of a band of Redcoats hid somewhat by the woods, which he thought was part of the main force. So he sent some of his troops to draw their fire and check them in the rear, while he, with the rest of his force, would take a shortcut through the woods, get in front of the corps, and cut it off from the main force. Washington was on his way with his main force when the boom of big guns rang out on the air. The sound caused him to change his pace to a quick step, and when he drew near Freehold Church, where the road forked, he sent Greene with part of his force to the right, while he, with the rest of the troops, took the left-hand road. Washington stood on the ground with his arm thrown up on the neck of his horse, when a man rode up and said the Bluecoats were in flight. Washington was vexed, for he was quite sure it was not true. Then came one with fife in hand, quite out of breath, and in great fright. He was seized at once, so that he would not scare the troops then on their way, and told that he would be flogged if he dared to spread the tale he had brought. Washington sprang on his horse and sent men out to learn the truth, while he spurred past the Freehold Church. The news seemed too strange to be true. He had heard but a few guns, and did not think there had been much of a fight. Was Lee to blame for this wrong move? He feared so. As he reached the high ground, he saw Lee and his men in full flight, and by this time he was in a fine rage. "What do you mean by this?" he asked in a fierce, stern tone as Lee rode up to him. At sight of Washington's face, Lee was struck dumb for a while, but when he could speak, he tried to tell why he thought it best to fall back. There was not much time for a talk, as the foe was not far off. The sight of their commander-in-chief put a stop to the flight, and plans were at once made to turn the luck. The place where they were was good for a stand, as it was on high ground which the foe could not reach but by a causeway. Lee knew that Washington had lost faith in him, so he held back and would give no aid to his chief. Washington rode back to Lee in a calm mood and said to him, "Will you keep command on this height or not? If you will, I will go back to the main force and have it formed on the next height." Lee said it was all the same to him where he was placed, that he would do just as Washington said and not be the first to leave the ground. Soon guns were heard on both sides. Lee and his men, who were in the foreground, made a brave stand, but were at length forced to fall back. Lee brought off his troops in good style, but the causeway that crossed the swamps in front of our troops in charge of Lord Stirling was the last to leave the ground. When he had formed his men in line back of the swamp, he rode up to Washington and said, "Here, sir, are my troops. What do you wish me to do with them?" Washington saw that the men were worn out with long tramps, hard fights, and the great heat. So he told Lee to take them to the rear and call in all those he might meet with who had fled from his ranks. The foe sought to turn both our flanks, but were checked by a sharp fire, and at length they gave way and fell back to the ground where Lee had been that morn. Here the woods and the swamps were on their flanks, and their front could not be reached but by the causeway. Great as was the risk, Washington made up his mind to charge on the foe, and this was his plan. General Poor was to move round on their right, General Woodford on the left, while the big guns shall gall them in front. But night set in ere they could act on this plan. Some of the troops had sunk on the ground, and all were in need of rest. Washington told them to lie on their arms just where they had chanced to be when it grew dark, as he meant to go on with the fight at dawn of the next day. He lay on his cloak at the foot of a tree, and Lafayette lay near him. At daybreak, the beat of drums roused them from their sleep, but the foe had fled, and had been so long on the way that Washington could not hope to check them. Our loss in the fight at Monmouth was 69, while 250 of the king's troops were left dead on the field. Some of the troops on both sides had died in the swamp, and some were found on the edge of a stream that ran through it where, worn out with their toils and weak from heat and thirst, they had crawled to drink and die. Lee's pride had been so hurt that he wrote to Washington in a way that he should not have done to his commander-in-chief, and he was brought to court by the Board of War and tried for his wrong deeds. His guilt was proved, and he was told that he could not serve for the next 12 months. He went to his home in Virginia, where he led a queer kind of life. His house was a mere shell and had but one room, but lines were chalked on the floor, and each space was used as if it was a room by itself. Here was his bed. There were his books, and in this space he kept all his horse gear, and in that one he cooked and ate his meals. With pen and with tongue he strove to harm Washington, whom his shafts failed to hurt, and who spoke not an ill word of Lee. He liked him as a friend, but did not think he was fit to lead troops to war. Lee died in the course of 4 years, and on his deathbed he thought he was on the field of war, and his last words were a call to his men to stand by him. For a year or two more the strife was kept up on the coast from Maine to Florida, and both redcoats and redskins took part in scenes that chill the blood to read of. Houses were burnt and land laid waste. Forts were stormed and seized from our troops, whose force was too small to hold them. Now and then there was a gain for our side, but in spite of his ill luck, Washington held on with a brave heart and would die at his post, but would not yield. In the first part of the year 1780, we find Washington in camp at Morristown with a lot of half-fed and half-clad troops. No such cold had been known in this zone. The Bay of New York froze so hard that the ships of war that lay in it were icebound. Food was scant, and there was a lack of firewood. Washington saw what a chance there was for a bold stroke, but he had no funds with which to fit out his troops or to move them to the coast. The cost of war was great, and the gold was scarce. He could not strike a big blow for New York to wrest it from the hands of the foe, as he might have done at this time had his troops been well fed and well clad, but he would do what he could in a small way. A bridge of ice had formed twixt New Jersey and Staten Island, so Washington sent Lord Stirling with 2,500 men to start up and seize a force of 1,200 redcoats. His lordship crossed in the night, but was seen and had to fall back to Elizabethtown. Some of his men fell into the hands of the king's troops, and some into the hands of Jack Frost. This raid gave a start to the foe, and they set out to tease and vex our outposts, which they thought could be done at small risk, as there was snow on the ground and the troops could be borne on sleighs. Not far from White Plains, and a score of miles from the outpost of the redcoats, 300 of our men had a post in a stone house known as Young's House. and that was the name of the man who owned it. It faced a road which ran north and south down through a rich plain, and so on to New York. Our men kept a close watch on this road to stop the redcoats who might seek to pass with food or livestock. The redcoats made up their mind to break up this nest of bluebirds, and the night of February 2nd was set for the task. The king's troops set out from King's Bridge, some in sleighs and some on horseback. The snow was deep, and it was hard for the sleighs to break their way through. The troops at length left them and marched on foot. They could not bring their field guns with them. Now and then they would come to a place where the snow was more than 2 feet deep, and they had to take byways and crossroads so as not to get near our outguards. The sun rose while they were yet 6 miles or more from Young's house. This spoiled their plan, but still they kept on. Ere they could reach the house, the news flew like wildfire that the redcoats were near, and men left their farms and homes to aid those in Young's house. But though they fought well, they had not strength to hold the fort. Not a few were killed. The house was sacked and set on fire, and the redcoats made haste to get back to their lines with those of our men whom they had seized, and who were sent to New York and put in the vile jails there. In the year 1780, France sent ships of war and troops to aid our cause, and to drive the redcoats from New York. The French troops were in charge of Count de Rochambeau, who was told to do just as Washington said, for he was commander-in-chief. Washington's heart gave a throb of joy at this proof of goodwill, and his grief was that he had not more troops of his own to join with these, that he might push for New York at once. He must wait till the rest of the French troops, then on their way, came to port. In the meantime his thoughts were turned to the south, where the redcoats, led by Cornwallis, waged a fierce war. Our troops there were in charge of General Greene, who was full of cheer and did his best to keep the foe at bay, but with poor luck as his force was small. But Washington had faith in him, yet such a large force of the king's troops had been sent by sea to aid Cornwallis that Washington feared that Greene would not be safe. So he wrote to Lafayette, who was on his way to meet the French fleet that had been sent to the Chesapeake Bay, to push on and join the troops at the south. At this time Washington was at a place near West Point, and his whole force on the Hudson in May 1781 was not more than 7,000, half of whom were not fit to take the field. Here word came to him of feuds at the north, and that the foe were in force on the north side of Croton River. Colonel Delancey, who led this raid, held the place that Andre had filled, and bore the same rank, and Delancey's horsemen were the dread of all those who dwelt in that part of the land. Our troops had an outpost not far from Pine's Bridge, in charge of Colonel Greene of Rhode Island, who had served all through the war. Delancey set out at night at the head of 100 men on horseback and 200 on foot. They crossed the Croton at daybreak, just as the night guard had been called off, and bore down on the outpost. They first went to the farmhouse where Colonel Greene and Major Flagg slept, and put a strong guard round it. Major Flagg sprang from his bed, threw up a sash, and fired at the foe, but was shot through the head and then hacked with sword cuts and thrusts. Then they burst through the door of Greene's room. He was a man of great strength, and for some time kept the foes at bay with his sword, but at last he fell. For what could one man do in such a fight? By the time the troops sent out by Washington reached the post, Delancey's men had flown. They tried to take Greene with them, but he died on the way, and they left him at the edge of the woods. Washington felt sad at heart when he'd heard of the death of his brave and true friend, Colonel Greene, and the next day he had his corpse brought to the west bank of the Hudson. Guns were fired to tell that one who had fought well had gone to his rest, and strong men shed tears as he was laid in his grave, for his loss was a source of great grief to all. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 14. The Close of the War. In the month of May, Cornwallis had planned to bring his troops to Petersburg. and strike a blow at Lafayette, who was near Richmond. Lafayette fled as soon as he heard that Cornwallis had crossed the James River, for he had but few troops and did not care to bring on a big fight till the men came up who were then on the way to aid him. Cornwallis thought he could soon catch the boy, as he called him, but his youth made him spry, and the redcoats did not get up to him. On June 10th, General Wayne came up with 900 men to add to Lafayette's strength, and this made him change his whole plan. With 4,000 men and Baron Steuben, he might hope to win in a fight with the redcoats, and he turned his face to the foe. Cornwallis was at the time twixt Lafayette and Albemarle Courthouse, where stores were kept. The Marquis, by a night march through a road that had long been out of use, got in front of the king's troops and held them in check. Cornwallis turned back and marched first to Richmond and then to Williamsburg, while Lafayette kept close in his rear. Here they had a fierce fight, in which the loss was great on both sides and the gain but small. At this time word came to Cornwallis that Washington had borne down on New York, and that he must send some of his troops to that town. This would leave him too weak to stay where he was, so on July 4th he set out for Portsmouth. Lafayette gave chase the next day and took post 9 miles from his camp. His plan was to fall on the rear guard, when the main force should have crossed the ford at Jamestown. But Cornwallis guessed what he meant to do and laid a trap for him. A sharp fight took place, into which Wayne threw himself like a madman. But the foe were as 10 to 1, and our troops were forced back to Green Springs. In July, Lafayette wrote to Washington that Cornwallis had left Portsmouth by sea, and he thought he was on his way to New York. It was true the troops had gone on board the boats, but though wind and tide were fair, they did not sail. With the French fleet to help him, Washington saw a chance to fight the foe by land and sea. So he turned from New York and marched to Virginia to aid Lafayette, who longed to have his chief at the head of his troops, but did not know he was so near. As our war-worn troops went through Philadelphia, they were hailed with shouts and cheers from the throngs that filled the streets. They kept step to the sound of the drum and fife, and raised a great cloud of dust, for there had been quite a drought. The French troops passed through the next day, but were not in the same style. They made a halt a mile from the town, where they brushed off the dust from their guns and their gay white and green clothes, and then marched with a light step to the sound of a fine band. Crowds were on the streets, and bright smiles and loud shouts met these who had come from France to lay down their lives, if need be, for the cause we had at heart. When Washington turned his back on New York, Sir Henry Clinton sent word to Cornwallis that he would not need the troops he had asked for, so Cornwallis went from Portsmouth to Yorktown, where he took his stand. Yorktown was a small place on the south side of York River. The stream at this point was not more than a mile wide, but it was so deep that ships of large size and weight could go through. Here he threw up works on both sides of the stream, which gave him a fine stronghold, as the banks were high and set out from the mainland. He thought there was no foe near but Lafayette, and had no great fear of one so young. He felt so safe that he wrote to Clinton that he could let him have a large force of men to add strength to New York, where it was thought our troops would strike the next blow. In the meantime, Lafayette threw out troops to the rear to work with the French fleets that would soon be in Chesapeake Bay, and so a net was drawn round Cornwallis at a time when he thought he was most safe. Washington was at Philadelphia on September 5th, and at Baltimore 3 days from that time. He left Baltimore on the 9th at daybreak, with but one of his suite, as he was in haste to reach Mount Vernon. The rest of his suite rode at their ease, and joined him the next day at noon. It was 6 years since Washington had seen his old home, and how full of toil and care those years had been. In 3 days he had to leave the dear old place, and with his guests push on to join Lafayette, who was at Williamsburg. By September 25th, the French and our troops were in camp near that town, and at once set to work to get things in train for the next fight. Cornwallis had built forts on the north and south banks of the stream, and had done all he could to add strength to Yorktown. Ships of war were in front, and boats had been sunk at the mouth of the stream. Fieldworks were at the rear with big guns on top, and there were long rows of trees that had been cut down and left so that their limbs stuck out and made a fence it would not be safe to climb. At the right and left of Yorktown were deep dells and creeks, and it was not strange that Cornwallis felt that he was in a sure stronghold. Our troops were 12 miles off when they took up their march on September 28th, and that night they went in camp 2 miles from Yorktown. Washington and his staff slept on the ground, his head on the foot of a tree. The next morn our troops drew out on each side of Beaver Dam Creek, the Americans on the east side and the French on the west. The Count de Grasse, with the main fleet, stayed in Lynn Haven Bay so as to keep off the ships that might come from sea to aid the redcoats. On the night of the 1st of October, our troops threw up 2 earthworks, on which the redcoats turned their guns at daylight and killed 3 of the men. While Washington stood near the works, a shot struck the ground close by him and threw up a great cloud of dust. One of his staff who stood near was in a great fright, but Washington was calm and showed no signs of fear. On October 6th, our troops set out to dig the trench that the first line would use in the siege of Yorktown. So dark was the night, and so still were the men, that the foe did not know of it until daylight. Then they fired on them from the forts, but the men were screened and kept at their work. By the 9th the trench was dug and the guns fixed to fire at the town. Washington put the match to the first gun, and a storm of balls and bombshells dared Cornwallis to come out and fight. For 3 or 4 days the fire was kept up on both sides, and bombshells crossed in midair, and at night flashed forth like great stars with tails ablaze of light. Our shells did much harm in the town and to the earthworks of the foe. The red-hot shot from the French forts northwest of the town reached the king's ship of war. The Sharon, a 44-gun ship, and 3 large boats for troops were set on fire by them. The flames ran up to the tops of the masts, and as the night was dark, the scene was a grand one to the eye, but a sad one to the heart. On the night of the 11th, a new ditch was dug by the troops led by Baron Steuben, and for 2 or 3 days the foe kept up a fire on the men at work. At 8 o'clock on the night of October 14th, they set out to storm both Yorktown and the point on the north bank at the same time. The vanguard of our troops was led by Alexander Hamilton. When at school, he wrote to one of his boy friends, "I wish there was a war," and in 1776, when he was all but 19 years of age, he was placed at the head of the men who fired the guns and bombshells. The next year, he was aide-de-camp to Washington, in whom he found a true and wise friend. With great joy and pride, Hamilton led the van in a headlong dash past the trees, which they pushed or pulled down with their own hands, where they could not climb them, and was the first to mount the wall. One of his men knelt so that Hamilton could use him for steps, and the rest of the men got up the best way they could. Not a gun was fired, and the fort fell into the hands of our troops with a small loss on both sides. The French stormed the fort at the point in as brave a way, but with less speed, and lost more men. Washington stood on the ground in the grand fort, where he could see all that took place. An aide-de-camp near him spoke up and said that he ran a great risk from a chance shot through one of the portholes. "If you think so," said Washington, "you can step back." Soon a ball struck the gun in the porthole, rolled on, and fell at his feet. General Knox seized him by the arm. "My dear General," said he, "we can't spare you yet." "It is a spent ball," said Washington in a calm voice. "No harm is done." When each charge was made and both forts were in our hands, he drew a long breath, turned to Knox and said, "The work is done, and well done." Then he said to his black man, "Bring me my horse," and rode off to see where next his lines should move, and how the trap could be closed on Cornwallis. Cornwallis found that he could not hold his forts. No troops had come to his aid, and he would soon have to yield to the foe. This was too much for his pride, so he made up his mind to leave those who were sick or had wounds and fly from Yorktown. His scheme was to cross the stream at night, fall on the French camp ere daybreak, push on with all speed, and force his way to the north and join Sir Henry Clinton in New York. A large part of his troops had crossed the stream on the night of October 16th, and the rest were on their way when a fierce storm of wind and rain drove the boats down the stream. They could not be brought back till daylight, and it was then too late for them to move on or turn back. The hopes of Lord Cornwallis were at an end, and on the 17th he sent a flag of truce and a note to Washington and asked that his guns might cease their fire for one day so that terms of peace could be drawn up. Washington feared that in the meantime troops from New York would reach Cornwallis, so he sent word back that his guns would cease their fire for but 2 hours. Washington did not like the terms drawn up by Cornwallis, so he made a rough draft of such terms as he would grant. These were sent to Cornwallis on the 19th, and he was forced to sign them, and in 2 hours his troops were to march out of the forts. At noon our troops were drawn up in 2 lines more than a mile in length, the Americans on the right side of the road, the French on the left. At 2 o'clock the redcoats passed out with slow steps and were led to a field where they were to ground their arms. Some of them, in their rage, threw down their guns with such force as to well nigh break them. On the day that Cornwallis had been forced to lay down his arms at Yorktown, the large force that was to aid him set sail from New York. They did not reach Chesapeake Bay till October 29th, and when they found they were too late, they turned their prows and went back to New York. The downfall of Cornwallis was felt to be a death blow to the war, and a great joy was felt throughout the land. Votes of thanks were sent to Washington, to de Rochambeau, and to de Grasse, and Washington gave high praise to all the troops for the way in which they had fought at the siege of Yorktown. From that time, the redcoats lost heart, and on November 25, 1783, they marched out of New York, and Washington marched in at the head of his brave men, who had fought and bled and borne all the ills that flesh could bear, that the land they loved might be free. In a few days, Washington was called to Annapolis to meet with those who had made the laws, and his chief men, who had been with him through all the sad scenes of the war, came to bid him goodbye. With a heart full of love, he said to them, "I cannot come to each of you to take my leave, but shall be glad if each of you will come and take me by the hand." This they did. No one spoke a word. Tears were in all their eyes. Washington left the room and went on foot to the boat, which lay at the end of what was then, and is now, Whitehall Street. His friends kept close in the rear. When Washington was in his barge, he turned, took off his hat, and waved goodbye. And those on shore did the same, and watched the barge till it passed out of their sight. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 15. First in Peace. At the close of the war, and of the year 1783, Washington went back to Mount Vernon. He reached his home to his great joy on the eve of Christmas Day, and he was in a good state of mind to keep the feast. "The scene is at last closed," he wrote, "and I am eased of a load of care. I hope to spend the rest of my days in peace." Mount Vernon was locked in ice and snow for some time. Washington wrote that he was so used to camp life that he could not help feel when he woke each day that he must hear the drums beat and must go out to plan or to lead his troops. He was now at his ease and longed for the spring so that his friends could come to him. "My way of life is plain," he said. "I do not mean to be put out of it, but a glass of wine and a bit of meat can be had at all times." He would not give notes of his life to those who wished to write it up at this time, lest it should look vain. "I will leave it to those who are to come to think and say what they please of me," he wrote. "I will not by an act of mine seem to boast of what I have done." As spring came on, friends flocked to Mount Vernon, and Washington met them in a frank way. His wife, too, was full of good sense and good cheer. She loved to knit and had been used all through the war to knit socks for the poor men who were in the ranks. But as Washington took his rides through his place, he felt the changes there since he had left. Old friends were gone, and the scenes of his youth were no more. Lafayette spent a few days with him, and the love he felt for the brave young man was as strong as at first. He wrote a sad note to him when he was gone, which showed what a warm place the young Frenchman had in his heart. He said, "As you left me, I asked if this were the last night I should have of you. And though I wished to say no, my fears said yes. I called to mind the days of my youth, and found they had long since fled to come back no more. I must now go down the hill I have climbed all these years. I am blessed with strength, but I some of a short-lived race, and may soon go to the tomb. All these thoughts gave a gloom to the hour in which I parted with you." Washington made a trip through some of the states of the West, and saw there was a chance for great trade there. He wrote much of what he had seen, but his chief joy was in his home and land, where he planted trees and loved to watch them grow. He writes down each month of what he sets out. Now it is a choice slip of grapevine from France, or it may be a tree that stays green all year round. Some of the bushes he set out still stand strong in their growth on the place. He notes the trees best for shade, and which will not hurt the grass. He writes of rides to the mill swamp in quest of young elms, ash trees, and white thorn, and of the walks he lays out and the trees and shrubs he plants by them. A plan of the way in which he laid out his grounds is still kept at Mount Vernon, and the places are marked on it for the trees and shrubs. He owned 5 farms, and he kept maps of each. He read much of soils, the way to raise good crops, and the best style of plows and farm tools to use. He rode the first half of the day to see that all went well. When he had dined, he would write till dark if he had no guests. If friends came, he did all he could to make them feel at ease and at home. He was kind and loved by all. He would not talk much of the war, nor of what he had done in it. He took great care not to talk of his own acts, so that if there had been a guest who did not know the facts, he would not have found out by a word from Washington that he was one who had won a great name in the eyes of the world. Though grave in his looks and ways, he loved to see youth glad and gay. He was fond of the dance, and it was long the boast of more than one fair dame that she had danced with the chief. There had been balls in camp in the dark days of the war. Washington, as we have seen, had been fond of the hunt in his youth, and Lafayette sent him some hounds from France, so he took up his old sport. But the French hounds did not do well, and he found they could not be trusted. Ere the war had been long past, it was found that there was need of new laws by which the states should be ruled. The chief men of the land were called to Philadelphia to form them, and Washington went from Mount Vernon to take part in the work. It was then that the code of laws was drawn up, which bears the name of Constitution of the United States. These laws said that the states should be ruled by a president. The choice for this post fell on Washington, and in the spring of 1788 he bade goodbye to Mount Vernon and made his way to New York, where he was to take the oath that he would serve the land and be true to her in peace and in war. As he passed through the towns, crowds came out to cheer him. Flags were raised, guns roared, and at night there was a great show of fireworks. When he came to Trenton, the place where in the past he had crossed the stream in the storm, through clouds of snow and drifts of ice, he found a scene of peace and love. Crowds were on the bank, the stream gleamed in the sun, the sky was blue, and all hailed him with joy. On the bridge that crossed the Delaware, an arch was raised and twined with wreath of green and gay blooms. As Washington passed 'neath it, a band of young girls, dressed in white and with wreaths on their heads, threw bright blooms at his feet and sang an ode that spoke the love and praise that were in all hearts. At Elizabethtown Point, he was met by men who had been sent from New York and led to a barge which had been made for his use. It was filled with seamen of high rank who made a fine show in their white suits. Boats of all sorts, gay with flags and some with bands on board, fell in the wake of Washington's barge, and as they swept up the bay of New York, the sight was a grand one. The ships at the wharves or in midstream dipped their flags and fired their guns, bells were rung, and on all the piers were great crowds that made the air ring with their shouts. On the last day of April 1789, Washington took the oath in front of the hall where the wise men of the land had been wont to meet in New York. He stood in full view of a great crowd to whom this was a new and strange sight. The states were to be as one, and this man, whose name and fame were dear to them, was to pledge himself to keep them so. On a ledge that bulged out from the main part of the house was a stand spread with a rich red cloth on which lay the Word of God, the Book of Books. Washington was clad in a full suit of dark brown homemade cloth, white silk hose, and dress sword with steel hilt, and his hair was dressed in the style of the day. As he came in sight, he was hailed with the shouts of the crowds in the streets and on the roofs. He came to the front of the ledge close to the rail so that he could be seen by all, laid his hand on his heart, bowed 3 or 4 times, and then went back and took his seat in an armchair near the stand. In a short time he rose and went once more to the front with John Adams, who was to be next him in rank, and the friends who were to stand by him in this new field. While the oath was read, Washington stood with his hand on the Word of God, and at the close he said, "I swear, so help me God." One of the men would have raised the book to Washington's lips, but he bent his head and kissed it. Then there was a cry of "Long live George Washington," and all the bells in the town rang out a peal of joy, and the crowd rent the air with their shouts and cheers. Washington bowed and made a speech that was full of good sense. Then all went on foot to St. Paul's Church to pray that God would bless the land. Washington felt most of all, as he wrote to his friends, a fear lest he should come short of what the land hoped to find in him. The eyes of the world were on him. He had won fame in the field, but how would he rule the state? There was still much to be done. Great Britain held some of the posts at the West, on the plea that debts due to some of her men had not been paid. The red men were still a source of fear to the homes in the Wild West, and there was no hard cash with which the states could pay their debts. He found that his time was no more his own. From dawn till dark men came to him, and he saw that he must be saved from this, or he could do no work. Mrs. Washington joined him, and soon days were fixed for the calls of friends. The house was kept well, but there was no waste. One who dined there wrote that there was no show. The president said a short grace as he sat down. 1 glass of wine was passed to each, and no toasts were drank. He was kind to his guests and strove to put them at their ease. He was strict in the way he kept the Lord's Day. He went to church, and he would have no calls on that day. As to Mrs. Washington, those who knew her at the time speak of her as free from all art. She met her guests in a well-bred way, as one who had ruled in a great house. She, too, was more fond of their home at Mount Vernon than of the new rank and place. To stay at home was the first and most dear wish of her heart. Washington was touched to the quick when he heard that someone had said that there was more pomp at his house than at St. James, where King George held his court, and that his bows were much too stiff and cold. Washington wrote, "I grieve that my bows were not to his taste, for they were the best I can make. I can say with truth that I feel no pride of place, and would be more glad to be at Mount Vernon with a few friends at my side, than here with men from all the courts of the world." He then goes on to tell how they treat their guests. At 2 or 3 o'clock each Tuesday they come and go. They go in and out of the rooms, and chat as they please. When they first come in, they speak to me, and I talk with all I can. What pomp there is in all this, I do not see. The red men, who could not be kept in peace, roused the land once more to arms. Washington did not wish for war, but he had to call out troops. They went forth and laid waste Indian towns. Washington thought it would be a good plan to meet the Indian chiefs and talk with them. 3 chiefs came to him and said they would go to the rest and try to make peace. Washington made a set speech and told them it would be a good work to do, or else those tribes, if they thieved and killed as they had done, would be swept from the face of the earth. He had thought much of the state of the red men in the land. He had but small faith in the schools for the youth, save as far as to teach them to read and write. The true means to do them good, he thought, was to teach them to till the ground and raise crops in the same way as the white folks. And he said if the tribes were pleased to learn such arts, he would find a way to have them taught. In the end, General St. Clair had to be sent out with troops to put the red men down. Washington's last words to him were to be on the watch, for the Redskins were sly and would wait for a chance to find him off his guard. But St. Clair did not pay heed to these wise words, and the Redskins got into his camp. Some of his best men were slain, and the whole force was put to rout. When the news was brought to Washington, he said in a quick way, "I knew it would be so. Here on this spot I took leave of him and told him to be on his guard. I said to him, 'You know how the Redskins fight us.' I warned him, and yet he could let them steal into his camp and hack and slay that army." He threw up his hands, and his frame shook as he cried out, "Oh, what a crime! What a crime!" Then he grew calm and said that St. Clair should have a chance to speak, and he would be just to him. St. Clair was tried and was found free from guilt. Washington's mother died at Fredericksburg, Virginia, August 25, 1789, aged 82. When her son first went to war, she would shake her head and say, George should stay at home and take care of his farm. As he rose step by step and the news of his fame was brought to her, she would say George was a good boy, and she had no fear but that he would be a good man and do what was right. In the year 1789, a great war broke out in France, in which Louis XVI lost his crown and his head, and deeds were done that you could scarce read without tears. Men seemed like fiends in their mad rage, and like wild beasts in their thirst for blood. In 1793, France made war on England, and in 1797 sought to break up the peace of the United States. But of this I will tell you by and by. In the meantime, the 4 years, which was the full term Washington was to rule, came to an end. He had no wish to serve for 2 terms, but the choice fell on him, and he once more took the oath on March 4th, 1792. In 1796, as France was still at war, it was thought best that Washington should hold his place for a 3rd term. But this he would not do. He made up his mind to leave these scenes and to give up that sort of life, and those who pled with him could not move him. He took leave of his friends in a way that moved them to tears, and his farewell speech, though in plain style, touched all hearts and made them feel what a loss it was to part with so great and good a man. On March 4th, 1797, John Adams took the oath and bound himself to serve as president for a term of 4 years. Washington was there, and as he rose to leave the house, there was a great rush to the door, as all wished to catch the last look of one who had for so long a time the first place in their hearts. So great was the crush that it was feared there would be loss of limbs, if not of life. As Washington stood in the street, he waved his hat as cheer on cheer rose from the crowd, and his gray hairs streamed forth in the wind. When he came to his own door, he turned to the throng with a grave face and tried to say a word or two. But tears rose to his eyes, his heart was full, and he could not speak but by signs. He soon set off for Mount Vernon, the dear home of his heart. He had been there but a few months when the French, by their acts, seemed to want to bring on a war with the United States. They took our ships at sea, and there was no way left but to stand up for our rights. President Adams wrote to Washington, "We must have your name if you will let us have it. There will be more in it than in a host of men. If the French come here, we shall have to march with a quick step." Washington wrote to President Adams, "I had no thought that in so short a time I should be called from the shade of Mount Vernon. But if a foe should come in our land, I would not plead my age or wish to stay at home." He saw the dark clouds that showed a storm, and he feared his days of peace would be few. It was with a sad heart that he felt his rest was at an end, but he had so strong a sense of what was right that he did not hold back. He said he would do all he could for the troops, but he would not take the field till the foe was at hand. For months, Washington led a life full of hard work. He had much to do for the troops, and at the same time work at home. He would write for hours and took long rides each day. To his great joy, there was, in the end, no war with France. He seemed in first-rate health up to December 12, 1799. On that day, a storm set in, first of snow, then of hail, and then of rain, and Washington was out in it for at least 2 hours. When he reached the house, his clerk, Mr. Lear, saw that the snow hung from his hair and asked him if he was not wet through. "No," said Washington, "my great coat kept me dry." But the next day his throat was sore and he was quite hoarse, and though much worse at night, he made light of it and thought it would soon pass off. When he went to bed, Mr. Lear asked him if he did not think it best to take something. "Oh, no," said Washington. "Let it go as it came." But he grew worse in the night, and it was hard for him to breathe. And though his wife wished to call up one of the maids, he would not let her rise, lest she should take cold. At daybreak, when the maid came in to light the fire, she was sent to call Mr. Lear. All was done that could be done to ease him of his pain, but he felt himself that he had but a short time to live. Mr. Lear was like a son to him, and was with him night and day. When Mr. Lear would try to raise and turn him so that he could breathe with more ease, Washington would say, "I fear I tire you too much." When Lear told him that he did not, he said, "Well, it is a debt we must all pay, and when you want aid of this kind, I hope you'll find it." His black men had been in the room the whole day and most of the time on his feet, and when Washington took note of it, he told him in a kind voice to sit down. "I tell you these things that you may see what a kind heart he had, and how, at his last hour, he thought not of himself." His old friend, Dr. Craig, who stood by his side when he first went forth to war in the year 1754, was with him in these last hours, when death was the foe that Washington had to meet. He said to Dr. Craig, "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go. My breath cannot last long." He felt his own pulse and breathed his last on the night of December 14th, 1799. His wife, who sat at the foot of the bed, asked with a firm voice, "Is he gone?" Lear, who could not speak, made a sign that he was no more. "'Tis well," she said in the same voice. "All is now at an end, and I shall soon join him." Thus lived and died this great and good man, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of those who loved the land of the free. Praise did not spoil him or make him vain, but from first to last he was the same wise, calm, true friend, full of love to God and of good will to men. Great and good men have been born into the world, but none of those whose name and fame rank as high as that of George Washington. End of chapter 15. End of The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard.